Hello, my friends. How are you today? It's Sue from Sue Pellin Designs. And you might have noticed we have a little change to my sewing room today. Today, we're going to be talking about storing your quilts. Not only your applique quilts, but all of your quilts. We're going to look at some different storage options and the best way to store your quilts to make sure they have a long, beautiful life ahead of them. So before I get started, I just wanted to welcome all of you. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sue from Sue Pellin Designs, and I love applique quilts. I like to make applique easier for all of our quilters and find a faster, more fun way to do applique. So I teach rotary cut applique, and tonight we are having the first of a 3-part series called Applique School. So if you haven't yet signed up for Applique School, go to my website, SuePellinDesigns.com, and right on the top, there's a banner that will help you sign up for Applique School so that you'll get the Zoom link for our 6 p.m. Eastern Time meeting today. So if you are here already today on Sewing and Slippers with Sue, let me just put my address in the comments section so that you can get over to SuePellinDesigns.com and sign up for Applique School so that you can come this evening. And let me know if you are here and where you're coming from. Okay, so let's dive right in because we've got a lot to talk about today, and I only want to take up about a half an hour of your time. We're not going to be sewing today, so I'm not going to take a full hour. We're just going to take a half an hour to talk about storing your quilts properly. Well, good morning, Elaine from Mississauga, Canada. Nice to see you here today. So I pulled in one of my display cases where I display my quilts. Now, many of you might recognize some of these old cabinets. This one happened to be from a friend of mine. He was cleaning out his aunt's house and her dining room set had to go. So I took the dining room set and this old china cabinet, probably from the 30s or 40s. Now this china cabinet had wood on the sides here. So the only glass part was the very middle of the cabinet. But I knew I wanted to display my quilts in there. So I took out the wood on the sides and I had a piece of glass cut to be the same size as the wood. I just brought in the wood pieces and had the glass cutter add these 2 side panels. Then I just reattached the housing for the wood. It's just a little thin strip with some little tacking nails to add the wood back onto the sides. I repainted this whole thing black because it went with my decor. And now I have a beautiful storage case for my quilts. Now they're not very organized in here. I've just been throwing things in here recently. And you will probably recognize some of the old quilts. These are mostly not my current quilts, but they're more of my older quilts. And there's a couple real beauties in here that I'd love to share with you. So the first one is a quilt that my mom purchased. And this one is actually dated. It's one of my very first applique quilts that I ever owned. And it's a beautiful quilt that is made in just 2 colors. Now, I believe that it was made in, here it is right here, 1967. Somebody took the time to embroider the date on this quilt, and I'm so grateful that you did. Wonderful. So nice to see you here today. Mary Pop, Cynthia Brown, Ellie Sacenti. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Ellie. Nice to see all of you. We've got people from Schoodic and Michigan. Bev, you're at Schoodic now. Oh, the eroding Schoodic coast. Yeah, we've had a lot of rain and a lot of bad weather. So I'm sorry about that, Bev. Hopefully everything's good up in Maine and you're not too flooded. Ellie from Georgia, Cynthia from Allatown, Pennsylvania, Debbie West from Cape Cod, and I think that's Bee on there that enjoyed her time with me and Penny on the Cape last week. So nice to see all of you. So I'm just pulling out a few of the quilts that are in my stash here because I've been collecting some older quilts, really just because I was afraid of them getting ruined and lost. And people were selling them on like Facebook Marketplace for next to nothing. You'll see some from my cousin that she was going to use in her rental house. And I was afraid of them getting ruined, so I rescued them from her rental house. So I'm just wanted to share with you today how I'm going to store these quilts. So anything that I really want to show is going to go in my case right here. And this needs to be rejuvenated from time to time. I need to clean this up because other quilts have gotten in there. Maybe my husband's put them away. And they're not only my antique quilts anymore. There's a quilt in there that my mom made. There's two in there that I made. And I really want this just to be my antique quilt cabinet. So I will be refolding some of these quilts and putting them back in the cabinet. Well, I wanted to share this quilt with you because it's so soft and beautiful. And this is a twin set. I actually have two of these quilts that I rescued off of Facebook Marketplace. And I love the design. The design is just some heart shapes and a circle to make the flower. Then there's this pretty little bud shape out here. Now, of course, we could make all of this with rotary cut applique. Now, the one thing that we can't do with the rotary cut applique right now is these big swags on the border. Now, I love to make swags, but I don't have a tool that will make them this large. But I did want to show you how the corner, it's really pretty how they did this pretty little teardrop shape in the corner with just two of the buds. So I use these quilts not only to rescue them and to preserve them for future generations, but I use these quilts as inspiration. So when I'm designing quilts, I have some new inspiration and maybe something different than I've seen in magazines and books. And I love to go back to old traditional quilts when I'm designing my applique. So we are going to refold some of these quilts and put them back in the cabinet. But for now, I want to show you how not to store your quilts. So let me get these quilts. I'm just going to pop them on top because I need to refold them before they go into the cabinet. And we're going to share a little folding technique today. So let me get this out of the way with my cabinet in here. There's not a lot of room to move around. So how not to store your quilts. Please, please, please do not store your quilts in big old garbage bags. Now, I mentioned that I rescued some quilts from my cousin who was going to put these quilts in her rental place down in South Carolina. And with a rental, you know you're going to get people that disrespect your things. So, or just, you know, people get sick, people have accidents, will spill things. So I didn't want these quilts to have to be washed over and over and over again in the rental house. So I decided that I would get her some regular blankets that she can wash over and over and over again, and I would rescue these quilts. Now, these quilts are not heirloom quilts. These are not the gems that you see in museums or in private collections. They're just old quilts that were made by her family. And because I am part of that family, I wanted to rescue the family quilts and make sure they didn't get abused. But I took them from her house in a big plastic garbage bag. Now, why is it not a good idea to store quilts in a big plastic garbage bag? Well, first of all, you can't see what's happening with the quilts. The black garbage bag is not going to let you peer through and make sure there's no critters nesting in there, or spiders, or mice, or moisture, right? What if the quilts got damp and sat inside this garbage bag? You'd have a big moldy mess. So I don't like to use these dark garbage bags for storage. And there's another reason for that. What if my husband took out the garbage and saw this bag hanging around my sewing room and threw out the entire bag? Now, he knows better than that, but it happens. It happens when people go to a quilt guild meeting and they bring their quilts in a big plastic garbage bag. They show their quilts for show and tell, and maybe they've forgotten them, they've left them behind, and the cleaning person says, oh, there's the garbage from last night's quilt show meeting, and he throws the garbage into the dumpster. Well, first of all, they're going to get damaged by throwing them in the dumpster. Secondly, that dumpster could be removed before you realize you left your quilts at the quilt show, before you go and rescue them. This has happened many, many times at quilt shows. When you go to a quilt show to bring your quilts to a show, never bring them in a plastic garbage bag. The custodian at that show might mistake your garbage bag for garbage and throw them away. So that is the number one do not do when you are storing your quilts. But since I was taking these straight to my home from hers, I decided to put them in a big old garbage bag and then empty them when I got home. So that was this weekend, and I haven't taken them out of the bag yet. So this is the first of many quilts. It's all of these beautiful little stars, and the fabrics are all over the place. She used whatever she had. She hand quilted this quilt, and you can tell these fabrics are not 100% cotton. This one's got some polyester in it, so it's not one of those heirloom quilts, but it's still worth saving. Somebody put a lot of time and effort into these quilts. So Dawn said, what are you going to use the quilts for? And I said, you know what? I just want them to be preserved. So I'm going to be purchasing a big old bookshelf for my TV room. And I'm just going to stack all of these old quilts in the bookshelf so you can pull them down and use them on the couch if you want to, and then fold them up and put them back on the bookcase. So they will be used. I'm not going to preserve these as far as keeping them museum quality because they were meant to be used and loved. And that's the joy of having quilts. You can use them, you can love them, and you can remember those aunts and grandmothers that made them before you. Well, I love this little quilt because that happy little sashing is a beautiful, probably 30s or 40s fabric. The binding and the backing is all that beautiful 30s fabric. So this was worth preserving. It is, again, hand appliqued and hand quilted with these cute little baskets. Now there's a big old stain on one of these blocks. I just saw it. Where did it go? I saw it even in the camera. Anyway, there's a big old stain on one of these blocks, and I'm going to need to give this a little TLC. There it is right there. Probably a blood stain. Who knows what that could be? So I'm going to need to give this a little TLC. I'm going to need to treat this with probably some Tide, or maybe the better thing to do is use that Dawn dish detergent. So I'm not worried about the colors running. There is a red in here, so there is a possibility of the colors running. So I'll probably soak this in the Dawn in my bathtub and pay special attention to that one spot to get rid of that spot so it doesn't get any worse. Then this will be nice and refreshed and clean for my family to use on the couch as they are watching television. So it's a little gem with all of these beautiful fabrics. Now, I probably might even recognize some of these fabrics. This is probably somebody's collection of fabrics over the years, their stash that they used. So I have no idea how to date this quilt because some of the fabrics are probably from the 60s and 70s, and others are probably from the 20s and 30s. But it's a really pretty little piece, and it deserved to be saved. Okay, the next quilt is... gosh, it certainly is a user. This is not a keeper, it's a user. This is a baby blocks quilt. And once again, every bit of fabric from any project they ever made in their lifetime went into this quilt. So it is not a beautiful quilt, but it is an interesting quilt. For somebody that loves to study fabrics like I do, this is a very interesting quilt. And what I love about this quilt is it was all machine finished. So people think that machine quilting is a new technique, and it's not new at all. People were machine quilting 100 and even 200 years ago. It just didn't really rise in popularity because machine quilted quilts were functional quilts. They were used. They were not show quilts. They weren't the ones going to the county fairs and winning the awards. But I love that the binding was also put on by machine. And I'd be really curious to know what's inside here, but I'm not going to take it apart because this is a good, sturdy, useful quilt that can be washed and rejuvenated and used by my family. It has a big old quilting design right over the surface, and this is great inspiration for me because my next project is to learn how to machine quilt on a long arm, and this is a great pattern that I could practice, this wave pattern. And so it's nice inspiration that even years ago on their domestic machines, somebody quilted this very large quilt and was very successful at it. And so I know that I'm going to master the art of quilting on a long arm frame in the very near future. So again, this is just a functional and fun quilt. It certainly is not an heirloom, but we're going to use it and we're going to love it and we're going to keep it in the family. All right, here's another quilt that I have always loved, and it's so simple. It is just your basic leaf shape with a stem and a couple of leaves. And I think there's 16 blocks in this quilt, all different colors of those flowers. But that mint green and the pink just makes me happy as your sashing and your cornerstones. Now this one is quite beautifully quilted with that pretty design. You can see it there on the border, that cable design. And that cable design is one that's really fun to mark with our Leaves Galore templates. So I'm going to be experimenting when I'm on my long arm with using Leaves Galore and Hearts and More to design my quilting designs. And I think that next week we're probably going to tackle some quilting designs using Leaves Galore and Hearts and More. So join us next week for Sewing in Slippers, and we will talk about some quilting designs. Now this quilt also has quite a bad stain on the binding, and the binding is white. Ladies, this is one of the reasons why I hardly ever use a white binding. When kids use your quilt, they want to scrunch up that top and snuggle under that quilt. And when they scrunch up that top and snuggle under it, all the oils from your face, your hands, your hair, that all gets on the edge of the quilt, and a darker binding or a print binding is going to camouflage those stained or dirty edges. So when I'm binding my quilts, I usually use the same fabric as my last border, or I use something darker from the quilt to highlight that outside edge. And while it's very pretty to have a white binding, it's not very practical. So I learned from my ancestors, and after seeing that big old stain right on the binding of that quilt, of course, a stain could be anywhere, but I always think the binding is the most used part of the quilt. So I tend not to use a light color binding like this. Now, isn't this a pretty little pattern that we could make with our Leaves Galore tools? Of course, that block is upside down, but this leaf shape is probably close to a 4-inch leaf. Let's measure that circle and the stem. It's really chunky. It's really kind of not very elegant, but it is charming. It is really an old-fashioned style quilt, and I think it's a wonderful one for us to pull apart and see how we could do this with Leaves Galore. So let me put it over here on my workstation, and we're going to put the camera down on my workstation so that we can dissect that quilt. We can reverse engineer that quilt, which just means we can figure out how it's made. So let me go onto my settings here and choose the other camera. Okay, and let's play with this design. So if we were to make this design, and I think someday I probably will, let's look at the dimensions. This quilter used a 14.5-inch block to get started. So it's a 14.5-inch white square. Then look at that curve. It's just about perfect for my 8-inch curve, and that is about 1 inch wide. Then those leaves. Theirs are not very elegant, but I think the 4-inch leaf shape is absolutely perfect for these 2 green leaves. And look at that. We're going to be able to use that 4-inch leaf shape for the flowers as well. Now, these leaves are a little bit larger. They're probably 5 inches, but they are tucked right up under that circle. So I think the 4-inch leaf would be a little bit more delicate, and I think it would make a prettier flower than the 5-inch that they are using. Now we could go with our 5-inch Leaves Galore tool, but those 5-inch leaves that we normally cut are a little slimmer, and that would be pretty as well. It would bring all the chunkiness down and make it a little bit more elegant. So we certainly could use either a 5-inch leaf shape or a 4-inch leaf shape. Now we're going to need some Hearts and More tools to make those circles. So let's grab our Hearts and More tools where we have 8 different circles to work with and decide which is the best size circle for the center. Well, I picked it up first thing. It is the 2.5-inch circle on template B from the Hearts and More. So we certainly could use that. We could make it a little smaller to make it a little bit more delicate. We could make it a little bit larger. Now look at what this quilter did. She used a 2.5-inch leaf center for her flower, but then she quilted around it. That quilting around would be 3 inches. So not only could you use the Hearts and More for your center, you could also use the Hearts and More for your quilting design. Now, if you wanted to hand applique this, and this was hand appliqued, then you would use your 3-inch circle, turn under your edges, which would end up with a 2.5-inch circle. But you know me, I'm not going to hand applique anything. So if I reproduce this design, it will certainly be done with rotary cut applique. And that means I'm going to fuse it, and I'm not going to hand applique that quilt. Now, I do love hand applique. And if you want to learn more about hand applique, you can come to our Applique School. We are going to have 3 days of applique, including 1 day. The second day will be hand applique. But today we'll be focusing on fusible applique. And you might remember that last week I started the San Antonio block with all of you. So I wanted to show you the result of my San Antonio block. Even though it's not finished yet, I still have to stitch that inner flower. And then once I stitch that inner flower, I'm going to find a golden color. And I haven't chosen a color yet, but I'm going to choose some type of a yellow or gold to make an inner flower within this pretty blue flower. So it will end up being a 2-layer flower. So I wanted to share that with you because this is the block that we made last week on Sewing in Slippers with Sue. Now, I did fall in love with this block, and I'm really excited about playing with some different design applications for this block and making the block in multiple sizes. So be watching for a class coming up on that, or even possibly a pattern made from this block. Now, I do want to talk about, I want to go back to storing your quilts. So there's some really nice packaging out there for storing your quilts. One of them is made by the Ziploc company, and I know that's upside down. Let me turn it around. So the Ziploc company makes these great big totes, and the totes have a zipper. Now, what's the difference between putting your quilts in a plastic Ziploc tote as opposed to a plastic garbage bag? Well, first of all, you can see right through it. So I know if there's any critters getting inside that bag, I can see right through it all the way around. So from time to time, I can inspect these bags, make sure they're not chewed on the corners from any little mice or critters. Make sure there's no ants or spiders or moths or anything else inside the bag. I can keep an eye on my quilts and make sure that they are in great condition. Also, these are not waterproof. I want to emphasize that because you don't want to put these anywhere where they might get moist. There is an edge on this Ziploc bag that is mesh. Now, quilters know this mesh because you've often made tote bags with that pretty little mesh, and it's a great way to make a beach bag so the sand will come out of the bottom of the bag. Well, Ziploc uses that mesh to aerate your quilts. So in other words, anything inside that bag, you can squeeze that bag down and the air will come out these vent holes so that you can stack one bag on top of the other and you can store them in the least amount of space possible. But what this also does is it keeps air flowing throughout the bag. So if anything did get wet, hopefully it wouldn't get moldy because there's some airflow and it's not just all encapsulated in this plastic, which wouldn't let moisture out. Okay, so you can see I have a whole collection of quilts in this bag. There's probably 10 or more quilts in here. And I love that because I'm keeping all of my quilts from a similar style together. So any class or any quilt that I made with clamshells or the leftovers from those clamshells, those are all in this one bag. So I can pull out my clamshell bag and have all the same style of quilts ready to go. All right, so Ziploc bags and these big, huge totes are a wonderful way to store your quilts. Now, when you have 10 or more quilts in a Ziploc bag, it gets pretty heavy. So I've also found these totes that you can get at Target, you can get at Walmart, you can get at Home Depot. I chose the ones from Home Depot, and these are the Hefty brand. Why am I using the Hefty brand? And by the way, I usually take off these labels, but I couldn't get this one off. I hate it when they make the labels so difficult to come off and they rip like that. I'm going to have to get some Goo Gone to get rid of the label. But I like to put my own label on here. So you can stick a mailing label right here over the Hefty label and write what's inside this tote. Why do I love these totes most of all? Because they have a snapping handle. You can pull them right open just this way. And you can still store a whole bunch of quilts in there. And this is my tote for this week's class that is called Quilt First, Applique After. That is the third day of Applique School. So I'm pulling out this tote right now because this is the one I'm going to need for Thursday's class. And inside are all of the quilts that are quilted first, and I'll be demonstrating appliquing after with glue applique. But I want to talk about right now folding your quilts. What is the best way to fold your quilts for storage? Well, one of the things that I love to do is to fold my quilts in thirds. And I'll demonstrate on this tiny little, it's actually a pillowcase instead of a quilt. When you fold your quilts, if you fold them in half like this and then like this, you are straining the fabrics on the outside of those folds. And over years and years of folding, especially if they're kept in plastic bags or plastic totes, you might see some discoloration on the edges. If you keep them out of direct sunlight, maybe you're not going to get that discoloration, but you've seen it yourself. When you open up an antique quilt, if it's remained folded for years and years, you're going to have a fold mark on these two edges. So instead, I recommend that you fold your quilts in thirds. Why in thirds? Well, we're estimating. We're guesstimating what a third of that quilt is. So if I fold it in thirds this time, and then I fold it in thirds next time, I'm probably not going to get the same third or the same harsh line. Because every time I fold in thirds, I'm probably not going to get the exact same spot. When I fold in halves and I match the corners, that's definitely going to be the same spot that I'm folding every time. So in thirds, it's just a guesstimate, and you'll probably get a different spot every time you fold. But here's an even better way to fold your quilts. When you have a bigger quilt, you can fold in diagonally. So when I fold this quilt, I'm going to fold one corner up diagonally, and then I can fold my other corner up to meet that edge, just like that. So I'm going to do the same thing down here. I'm going to fold one corner up diagonally, just like this, and then I can fold another corner up to meet that edge. So I'm making a rectangle by folding my quilt diagonally with the corners going up towards the middle. Then I'm going to fold in half, and that's going to make a nice rectangle, and in half again. That's going to make it just like it would if you had folded it on the straight grain. Now, why is folding diagonally a better idea than folding on the straight grain? Well, the same principle applies. When I bring up these corners, I can bring them up a different amount every time. As long as I'm matching any straight edges or any diagonal edges, if I keep them going diagonal to each other and keep the straight edges together, I'm always going to end up with a rectangle. Now, it might be a different size rectangle every time. That's a good thing because these edges won't have a harsh fold line. I'm going to fold them in, and it's probably going to be a different spot every time. Also, when you're folding on the straight grain, you are following one thread along that grain, and if that thread gets worn or broken, it's going to create a real weak spot on your quilt. Even if you folded the same way every single time on the diagonal grain of these fabrics, if one thread breaks, it's not running the whole length of your quilt. So if a thread breaks, you're only going to have one little weak spot rather than a whole weak line on your quilt. So folding on the diagonal, also putting your binding on the diagonal is always a good idea because it will extend the life of your fabrics. So I'm going to fold this quilt up and get it ready for Thursday's class, where we're going to be doing quilt first and applique after. That is our third day of Applique School. Oh, sorry, that's my sewing machine cam that I was not ready to sew with today. Now, for those of you that are looking at the quilt in the background, that quilt is My Magical Garden. Now, I have covered over the quilt in the back here. My Magical Garden is a quilt that I'm going to be doing with my students on March 19th. We're going to kick off that quilt. If you have purchased the My Magical Garden course in the past, you have already received an invitation to join in that quilt along again. Whether it is to make the quilt again or just to encourage our newer members who are starting the quilt for the first time. I want to encourage all of our My Magical Garden participants to come again to the quilt along and follow along as our newbies make this quilt. Now, if you are new to applique, My Magical Garden is a wonderful way to learn all of my fusible rotary cut applique methods along with blanket stitching. So if you're not comfortable yet doing fusible applique, this is the perfect quilt to gain the experience you need over a 9-month course. And by the way, this course you can take in your own time. You don't have to do it as part of the Quilt Along, but while we're doing it as a Quilt Along, it's a great motivating factor to get you to get this quilt finished in a 9-month period. So we're starting the quilt on March 19th, and we will be finishing up before the holidays. And our final show and tell will be in January next year. So we're going to give you a couple of months to get this quilt quilted and bound so you can come back and show off your beautiful work. So My Magical Garden is beginning on March 19th. And if you want in, you can go ahead to my website, SuePellinDesigns.com, and look at the online courses. This online course is called My Magical Garden. Now, for our members of Ahead of the Curve, members always get discounts. So our Platinum Leaf members get this course at half off. Our Silver Leaf members get 15% off. And our Gold level members get 25% off this quilt course. So come and join me for My Magical Garden beginning on March 19th. Now, I did want to just take a bit of your time to talk about Applique School. Applique School is a great way to learn 3 different methods of applique. I'm going to be covering fusible rotary cut applique on our first day. So all of my members out there, if you want to come, feel free. We would love to have you. And I love your testimonials when you tell how much you enjoy our Ahead of the Curve membership. But this is really for people who are new to rotary cut applique. If you want an explanation of what rotary cut is, what rotary cut applique is, and how it's done, I'll be demonstrating Misty Fuse. I'll be demonstrating how to use the Leaves Galore and the Hearts and More tools. So just like I mentioned, we can take an old quilt and we can model our newer quilts after an old one. The Ahead of the Curve membership gets into design. It gets into the techniques that you need to learn how to do beautiful applique, great quality fusible applique, applique that can win awards at your local and at national shows. So this is a course this is a program that will teach you all the ins and outs of applique. Now, our Applique School gets into even more forms of applique. Not only are we going to do rotary cut applique on day 1, but we're going to cover hand applique on day 2 and quilt first, applique after methods with glue applique on day 3. So if you haven't been to Applique School before, I want to invite you to come on down, sign up on my website, SuePellinDesigns.com. You're going to find a banner on the top of the homepage that brings you to the registration form. All of these Applique School days are on Zoom, and all of our classes in the Ahead of the Curve membership are on Zoom. Even our My Magical Garden Quilt Along, that's on Zoom too. So it's a great way to get together with other quilters and pursue a passion that you love and expand your applique abilities. Well, I'm going to call it a day. I have Applique School this evening, so all of this mess needs to magically disappear. I've got to clean up my sewing room, refold all these quilts, put them back in the cases, and get them tucked away so I'll be ready for Applique School tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. There will be time for demonstrations, there'll be time for Q&A, and there'll be time for me to tell you more about our Ahead of the Curve membership and our My Magical Garden Quilt Along. So everybody, I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm signing off now. It's Sue Pelland from Sue Pelland Designs, and I love to sew in my slippers with all of you every Tuesday. So come back next week and we'll do some more rotary cut applique. Bye, everybody.